Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Allan Boesak. I am a theologian here in Cape Town, and I am connected to the University of Pretoria. I also have a much longer history with African Sun Media, who published some of my works before. And I'm thinking specifically of a book that came out in 2005 entitled The Tenderness of Conscience, African Renaissance and the Spirituality of Politics. And also in that same year, a book in Afrikaans called Die Vlug van Gods Verbeelding, which was a retelling of biblical stories, 3 from the Hebrew Bible and 3 from the New Testament, centering around women, and tried to place women in the center with the question, what happens to the story when a woman, or the woman about which the story is told and whose name is sometimes not even mentioned? What happens if we place the woman in the center of the story and read the story from her point of view? I have found my work with African Sun Media, with those publications, very satisfactory. But I really want to say just one or two things about my most recent publication that came out with African Sun Media. It is entitled The Children of the Waters of Meribah, and it is about what I call the Miriamic tradition. So the question that I raise for Black liberation theology is basically the following. We have heard from Africans, from other indigenous peoples, from Native Americans, from Palestinians, what happens with your Exodus story that begins with the God of the enslaved people of ancient Israel, this God who takes their side, and the God who rescues them from the hands of the Egyptians, brings them across the Red Sea into a new land. But what happens when they move into that new land? According to one tradition, the Mosaic tradition, the tradition of Moses, in that Exodus story, the Israelites then, and you see this in the book of Joshua, in some blitzkrieg and a movement of conquest and annihilation of the original peoples and the indigenous peoples of all those countries, they then simply take the land. And Africans and indigenous peoples today tell us, but that's exactly what happens to us. What about your Exodus story? Black theology has never really answered that question. But in reading and rereading women and their take on the story, I've come to the conclusion that there are actually two traditions in the Exodus story. The one is the tradition of Moses. One can call it the patriarchal tradition, which does indeed end up as a story of conquest and of genocide. The other is the Miriam tradition, which we call the Miriamic tradition. And that gives us another idea, a completely different idea from what happens in the liberation of Israel from Egypt, from enslavement, what happens at the Red Sea, where Miriam takes the lead and sings that famous song that we see in Exodus chapter 15, the first 2 verses and the last 2 verses, 19 and 20. And then the rest is sort of taken over by the stronger patriarchal tradition, which suppresses the Miriamic tradition. And then Miriam pops up, because she disappears in Exodus 15 and then pops up again in the book of Numbers chapter 12. And there she plays a totally different role, challenges Moses' idea of who this God is, who supposedly speaks only through Moses. And that's the question Miriam asks. And what happens if God speaks also through the Miriams of this world? And you bring in the viewpoint of Miriam and bringing in the viewpoint of the women. And then I ask certain very pertinent questions, I think, of Black theology, if we had taken not the Moses patriarchal tradition as our point of departure, which we have done, but rather take the Miriamic tradition, which I propose that we should do, what happens? What kind of theology do we then develop? What difference would it make to Black theology in terms of the question of who God is, of the quality of the leadership that God wants for God's people, of the quality of our liberation? What does liberation actually mean? If it's not a story of violence and conquest, but a story of inclusion, like Miriam's tradition tells us, what difference would that make to us? And wherever Black people, African people read that story and think of this other, in my view, more authentic application, what would happen to questions of the land and questions of living together with other people, question of inclusivity at all sorts of levels? So I'm hoping that that book will be a contribution to what I regard as a very, very important debate. And I must say that African Sun Media that has brought out this book in South Africa has helped to broaden that conversation. Now it's not just people in America who can engage with us, but people all over the continent of Africa. And young scholars must think of using this portal that African Sun Media does offer, because our voice must be heard in the voice of global scholarship, in the global debates, in the global exchange of views on Africanicity and Africanity and decolonialization and coloniality and decoloniality. And these are all extraordinarily important subjects that cannot be discussed without authentic African participation, and especially young scholars must think of how they can let their voice be heard in these debates. And African Sun Media is offering, at least people like me, this wonderful platform. And I hope that young people who are in academia, it doesn't matter what discipline, because they cater for all these disciplines, will make use of this opportunity and join in what I see as a very important, invigorating, and relevant discussion across the world.